I think it's going to be a question how this stuff is effectively managed and dealt with. But I just think it's interesting. And we've made this point before, how the Democrats and the Republicans, they really just represent two different parts of capital, different sectors of capital. And I was reading something the other day that perfectly illustrated this. Was when there was the talk of the $2,000 checks. The Republicans proposed a bill for the $2,000 checks, but in it, they included this repeal of Section 230. It gives these social media companies immunity for things that their users post. Yeah, that was considered a quote unquote poison pill for the Democrats, because this is the Democrats' sector of capital. It's social media, it's big tech, Silicon Valley, big tech. And they allow them to, what was the name of the thing in California that passed that lets these Uber drivers be considered?
Prop 22.
Yeah, Prop 22, or that lets DoorDash drivers be considered independent contractors. The Democrats
Kamala Harris's brother-in-law, who she's pushing to be AG for our whole country, was a senior lawyer for Uber. That was his previous gig.
So this is the Democrats' sector of capital. They will maybe make a show of standing against certain sectors of capital, but then other sectors of capital, they are fine with letting them just like fuck you over. And that's, it goes back to the 90s when Clinton passed the Telecommunications Act, which allowed a lot of this right-wing media we see today, which allowed Fox News and Sinclair Broadcasting and all these local...
Yeah, it allowed them to grow. It
right-wing talk radio.
It took away the limit on how much you could own, which is how we have something like Sinclair Media.
It's a big part of the kind of the monolithic nature of right-wing talk radio. I will say that I think, quote unquote, freedom of speech here in the United States, first of all, and it wasn't some great communist pointing this out, it was H.L. Mencken who said that freedom of the press belongs to those who own one. I don't think you're necessarily getting this vision of the freedom of the press that you intended when you have so many outlets gobbled up by these big media companies, and that effectively limits the speech and it limits what is discussed. But I think that freedom, it serves as kind of a salve. It's like cope in a way. We have, in some ways, limited power to really change things in this country, but you can complain as much as you want. You can go and blow off steam on Facebook. And Trump is, like I said, probably pacing around the White House right now because he can't blow off steam and post something on Twitter. It's like in this country, you have the right to complain. You have the right to post whatever you want for the most part.
You know what? You have the right to organize, right?
Yeah, but
you have the right to organize those rent strikes and other kinds of strikes that you were talking about that do hit them where it hurts, and that's still totally legal.
I think ultimately it's a question of, though, it's like people have limited financial resources these days to engage in some of these things. But it's like there's this study that was done that said that the only correlation between people's desires and like actual policy legislation was between the desires of the rich. Like you heard
about the Princeton study?
Yeah, it said
that the Princeton study found that the constituent issues had a statistically zero effect. I think is the term they use. Statistically zero effect on what politicians did, and the highest correlation was with their donors.
Right. And so that's who really runs the game right now. I mean, like in theory, we have the power to do all these things that can change things, but in practice, the power of the wealthy is so great that they have really run the show. And I think will continue for the foreseeable future unless we really, ultimately the solution is like we've got to like once and for all redistribute power and ownership, and the means of production have to be owned collectively.
Conversation around what to do with social media is a potential gateway to that. And I think you're going to see a lot of fight for that conversation even happening, because if it happens, it's hard to argue against what we're talking about. And then from there, it begs the question of like, well, why do we run anything else in such an authoritarian way? I mean, capitalism is top-down authoritarianism at work, right?
It's do what your boss says or starve.
Yeah, and so it's like, why do we necessarily run everything else this way? Why are all of our institutions outside of government institutions under such unaccountable control? And so I think that presents a difficulty. Like these social media companies are not down for this conversation. They don't want it happening. That's for sure.
I think you're right, because you had a bunch of right-wingers now who are upset because they're shadow banning, I guess, Diamond and Silk, or they think their right-wing bullshit is being shadow banned. I think you're right. This could be a gateway into discussion of these greater subjects. It's like people are all of a sudden concerned about all the power that social media companies have. What about the power that like every large corporation has over your life, over this country, over our politics? I think that's what we should be talking about. But I should say, as socialists, our goal is not the continuation of the Democratic Party in power. It's not just to keep this Trumpian Republican Party out of power, but it is to continue going from here. It is, I think, to kind of have a radical democracy that continues to challenge corporate power and bourgeois power until we ultimately defeat it. So, and I think we can do that with kind of a radical social democracy. I think we just need to make clear that we're not implementing reforms just for the sake of reforms. We're implementing reforms to build our movement and to build our power and to ultimately build support for a post-capitalist society. However we do that, whichever parties or new parties have to emerge for that to happen, that's where we want to go. So,
but I think for the time being of where we are now and what we can achieve in the immediate, these Republicans definitely overplayed their hand. It's a matter of, how much we can discredit their agenda and promote ours.